This is Flora Sapio from Università degli Studi Orientali of Naples, Italy, and I'm talking to you from Rome tonight on the 11th of April, 2020. And tonight with us we have, as a guest, Professor Larry Catá, whom we are interviewing as part of our interview series on the COVID-19 conference that will be held on April the 17th from 9:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. US East Coast time. So let me welcome Professor Becker.
Well, thank you, Flora. It's delightful to be here and to be on the other side of the camera this time.
Yeah, exactly. And thank you for agreeing to be interviewed. I guess that most of our viewers tonight and in the days leading up to the COVID and International Affairs workshop would benefit from your perspective on the current crisis. And in order to introduce the seminar and to give everyone an opportunity to learn something more on the ongoing crisis, I would like to ask you a few general questions about the ongoing events and the ongoing crisis.
Okay, that would be delightful. Just be gentle with me.
No, I'll try to ask you really very simple and very general questions. And the first question actually will be, or I should say is, about the seminar itself. Like in these days, in these weeks, there have been quite a few conferences and events on the coronavirus crisis, but most of them have been about the disease itself, or else they have examined the responses that various national governments are providing to the coronavirus. Yet the conference that you are organizing seems to be quite different in that it is completely focused on international affairs. Could you explain to us why you are focusing on international affairs rather than other aspects of the coronavirus?
All right. Well, thank you very much. That the question is actually harder than it sounds. Let me give you just a very brief perspective. And it comes from having watched the progress of this pandemic from what looked like just a new variety of flu that started in Asia to the pandemic that all of a sudden descended on us in January and February of this year. In the course of the progression of this disease to epidemic to pandemic and the responses that have come, what I noticed was a couple of things. One, there is a sort of, and this is not a criticism of anyone, it's just, it seems to be natural, there is a sort of narcissism in the responses and in the analytics to the responses to this thing. The first thing one worries about, of course, in the context of a disease is oneself. And then one worries about one's family. Then one worries about one's city. Then one worries about one's province. And one worries about one's state. One worries about one's nation. And by the time you're done with all of that, you are exhausted from worrying, and you're focused on that, starting from the perspective that indeed the disease will have, is to some extent fatal. When it is not, it can be extraordinarily uncomfortable and draining. And we are not yet sure about much about the disease other than that it's highly contagious and it has a mortality rate in it, and it causes tragedies of all kinds. And so thinking about this, I said, well, okay, and of course, this is reflected not just in this natural tendency to start with the self and then with the pools, the circles, ever widening of connection, familial, societal, political, economic. But it also suggested to me that, in fact, when you looked at that, what you saw reflected in this notion is what people have been talking about in a political terms, as in the return to the state, or the destruction of globalization, or its recasting in light of the triumph of the local, or the triumph of the state, or the triumph of a politics from a period that we thought had been finished anywhere from 70 to 100 years ago. And then I thought to myself, well, you know, that's certainly the way one ought to look at this from a short-term perspective. But long-term, globalization is not going. The interconnections and interlinkages which have refashioned the world in its societal, political, and economics has not disappeared, has not changed in its entirety. It's transformed to some extent, it's been challenged, and it will to some extent have to evolve or develop in the face of the challenge. But it might make sense in this context to look not from the perspective of the individual blossoming out in this way to the state, but to start from the other end. The other side of the analytical spectrum, where you would have started before September 2019, and which it seemed to me had largely dissipated, except as a consequential matter. And so what we tried to do was to get some scholars, researchers, and people who are in the trenches, who are interested in and who focus on this, to start by focusing on the outside, that is the global context in which we find ourselves, and then to work our way in. So that's a long answer to a short question. And
to a short and simple question. Well, the second question will be equally brief and to the point, and I hope it will result in an equally, I don't want to use the adjective complex because I don't like it. So I will say I hope it will result in an equally intelligent, clever answer. So this far, well, various perspectives on the COVID-19 crisis have been considered. First and foremost, the epidemiological perspective. Second, the perspective of domestic responses to the crisis. But in your answer, you have highlighted two different kinds of responses or perspective or points of view. The individual response that leads to a focus on one's most immediate environment, and then the perspective of globalization. So, and here comes the question. You are famous not only for your work on law and international affairs, your work on China, you are also famous for your work on semiotics. So please give us a symbolic or a semiotic perspective on the virus, and let us understand if there are some perspectives, some point of view on the virus that we have neglected, some aspects of the virus that we could be looking at but we haven't seen yet.
Oh. Now,
that's a very difficult question.
I wish I had an hour. Let me at least take a stab at.
But the virus as a sign and as a symbol.
Well, that's right. That's right. And when we deal with semiotics, of course, we're going back to the root of meaning of the words we use, which themselves are symbolic and which themselves are redolent with meaning in the way, and that meaning may tell us as much about the significance of this thing, the object, the virus, and its interactions with humans and human society, political, economic, and the like, as the virus itself. And so when we look at this, indeed, you you really hit it on the head when you suggest that to some extent the pandemic is itself a semiotic exercise, and consciously or unconsciously, all collectives, individual collectives, and some individuals have been responding to the pandemic, to the virus, from a semiotic perspective. And let me give you just a couple.
I mean, just for our viewers, I want to make it very clear that we all believe that the emergency is a very real one, that the virus is a very real one, and we're taking it seriously. we are adopting all precautionary measures. So my question about, you know, signs and symbols, I mean, I wasn't trying to imply anything about the virus. The goal of the question was to obtain a different perspective on the symbolic aspects of another otherwise extremely real, concrete, and dangerous phenomenon.
Oh, no. And exactly. And I'm glad that you underlined that point, which is where I was going. So I'm going to try to give you just a couple of provocations so you can see where this is coming from. And to some extent, as real as the human tragedies of the virus are, the longer term human drama that will result from the semiotics of the disease once it has dissipated will to some extent mirror, in terms of its intensity, in terms of its effects, in terms of its consequences, and perhaps even in terms of its tragedy, the actual human tragedy that we've seen now with well over 1 million infected and well over 100,000 deaths, which is an extraordinary event for our times. So let me give you a couple provocations. Here's the first one. When you're looking at the semiotics, you're looking at the way in which we tend to use words to convey meaning, and in conveying meaning to construct the reality around which the deaths, the threat of the disease can be placed, and therefore serves as a guide to the only possible or the measurable best way of responding to it, right? So here's one. Wuhan virus, China virus, pandemic, the use of the choice of the words and the battle between the Americans and the Chinese with respect to the name of the thing itself suggests that semiotics in terms of the meaning ascribed to the virus has no nationality.
The virus has no nationality. The virus knows no border. The virus is a virus.
Well, exactly, except as a semiotic exercise, in which case we give the virus meaning by giving it nationality. And in the process, we devote a tremendous amount of time to it. But it is a exercise that isn't merely foolish, a bunch of Americans and Chinese from the respective propaganda ministries fighting over the control of a narrative. It actually will have potentially significant consequences, everything from the development of theories and applications about breaches of international human rights or other international law, to the development of a case that may well be brought before the International Court of Justice. We already hear these things are coming. People are grumbling about this, but all of this really focuses on the semiosis of the disease itself, and semiotics not merely as an exercise of a bunch of white-haired intellectuals, but semiotics that then has bite. All right, so that's one.
The production of meanings, the use of words, the creation of words and expressions, the creation of new meanings that do not remain confined to the realm of the academia, but produce very, very concrete effects on the world around us.
Well, that's right. And these words draw blood. Here's another one. The morality of the virus. We talked about its nationality, but semiotics may also go to the investing of the word, of the object of the virus, with a morality. Well, to what extent is the virus moral? And in that context, we have a tremendous amount of discussion. We know the usual one. Most religious organizations will encounter the virus from a moral perspective, but they're not the only ones. Politicians have been using this as a moral anvil on which they will hammer their own particular programs. There were the instances, for example, on the use of law to advance moral projects that in ways that may be immoral by viewing the virus as a sign or a symbol that suggested a necessary course of action. What I'm referring to, of course,
by attributing a sense of morality, and indirectly form of consciousness to an organism that I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not an epidemiologist, but I I know that viruses are neither, strictly speaking, simply speaking, they're neither alive nor dead.
Yeah, but it's
But they're
irrelevant.
not conscious organisms as such.
Now remember that, of course, in the context of semiotics, the object of the imposition of meaning, the object which becomes symbol and sign itself, has very little to say about what it is that is constructed on it. And that's what makes this actually very interesting. No one talks about the semiotics of the cold or the semiotics of my hair color, and yet meaning and consequences fall from it, but usually from outside. And so here we've got one of those consequences. And the reference, of course, was in the United States when a number of governors used their emergency authority with respect to the virus to shut down everything but essential services. Some governors used that as a means of advancing what they thought was a moral position ascribed to the virus by shutting down, for example, abortion services as non-essential. And so we see that. So there's a moral object, there's a moral sensibility, a moral semiotics to this, just as there is in nationalizing the virus as well. But that's not the end of semiotics. There is as well, in the context of business and human rights, for example, the notion of the virus as having inherent within it a responsibility on those actors whose relationships may be affected by it. A great example now has been the debates that have been going on in consequence of the virus to strengthen and to redirect not just moral, but certainly quasi-legal and certainly economic responsibility onto large multinational enterprises for the welfare of downstream workers who are affected by their decisions. In one case, of course, we're dealing with the garment sector. A lot of it is centered in Bangladesh, when mostly European and American brands and multinationals have to cut their orders because their economies have shut down. The effects of that are being felt by the workers in Bangladesh rather necessarily than the consumers in Europe or the United States, and it felt in a much more direct and in a much more tragic way. But in a tragic way that's circular, because to the extent that they no longer have orders, the local factories will no longer have work. To the extent they no longer have work, people no longer have money. To the extent they no longer have money, they will be encouraged to engage in the kind of risky behaviors that then augment the likelihood or the potential for the virus to come back and affect them again. And so
Or the potential to engage in the potential to engage in the informal sector of the economy,
right,
which is a lot more.
Right. But again, wrapped around the virus. So we start with the virus, we move from virus to economic responsibility grounded in law, to the consequences of the failures of that responsibility is not on states, but on multinational enterprises, on production chains. And then we move from there back to the virus itself. So semiosis in this case produces not only an effect, that is a way in which one looks at something, that is the responsibilities of the private sector, but then it wraps in on itself again and becomes a medical condition as well because of the way that plays out.
It seems to me that the very simple action, to attribute, to make a meaning for the virus, for COVID-19, is at the same time both cause and effect.
And that's the irony. It's not just the irony, but it's actually one of the most extraordinary aspects of the virus.
So we have interlinked causal chains who seems to be collapsing on themselves.
Not just collapsing, but exploding.
Exploding, collapsing, or even imploding, or simply becoming something else that, a causal chain as we think about it, or as we used to think about it before January, February, or March 2020.
Right, but it's worse than that, because in a sense, and this is a tendency of human beings anyway, if you start placing meaning on the back of the virus, if you start reordering the way in which you approach reality on the back of the virus, eventually you're going to place so much on this virus and the event, so much semiosis on this thing that it will collapse on itself. And in collapsing on itself, the debris that is left will cause, again, as much tragedy as the physical tragedy that comes from the physical human interactions with the virus itself. So again, this is just three small things here that we can talk about when we talk about the semiotic.
And this looks like the beginning of a very exciting conference that will be held once again on April the 17th, 2020, 9:30 a.m., 12:30 p.m. U.S. East Coast time. Before we wrap up our interview, there is anything you would like to say to our viewers?
No, I'm just very excited to have this small opportunity. You've asked some very difficult questions, which I've appreciated. You've made me think a little bit, and I hope that some of our viewers will engage with us. The conference website is open to questions, inputs, and
we are ready to take questions from the public also through the conference website or also by email.
Exactly right. Well, thank you very, very much.
No, thank you for being with us today. And I'm really looking forward to be a part of this event.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Bye.